All right, my friends, it's Francisco Ricardo. We're in the home front of the West Coast. Very, I think, low-key conversation today, if it's all right with you. I think the thing I'd like to point out, see what you think about this. I just seem to think that it's pervading the air. And that is the idea of the moral judgment of people and of things. The moral judgment meaning that, whenever I have a conversation with myself, with a text, with a film, with another person, it's never two things. It's always three that are in this conversation. The third one, beside myself, say for example, and the other party, whether it's a person or work or anything like that I might be in dialogue with, is this other sort of overhanging idea that at some point it's gonna, kind of make a forceful entry into the room and eventually take over. And that's the idea of, some kind of verdict, that it boils down to whether this is good or whether this is bad, whatever it is. It's just, I can't remember the last conversation that I heard or that I was a part of in anything, whether it was social involvement or artistic work, that didn't eventually, no matter how open-ended it began, end up circling around the idea of whether someone is right or wrong, or something is right or wrong, or whether, in the end we have to render the idea that someone is guilty of this or something is somehow wrong, or maybe in a way it's just this is the right thing to do when we should be thinking that it is wrong, or it's the wrong thing to do when we should be thinking it's the right thing. That kind of polaristic judgment is a very important element of what it means to be a discriminating individual, because of course the idea that you are coming up with what you feel are kind of elements of your own character reflecting in the sphere of what you think is right or wrong onto something is very key. So it's a reflective of who you are. It's as if to say, I don't know about art, but I know what I like. It's the idea is that, the art doesn't connect with me. I don't know enough about it to really say anything. But if I render a judgment, then that judgment is me. So somehow I'm injecting myself into the conversation with some degree of investment in it, by confirming to you that my position on these matters is a form of presence. It's a form of, if you like, maybe even being informed in a way. Of course it isn't. It's not necessary, on the other hand, to be encyclopedically knowledgeable about what it is that we might be talking about. It doesn't really come to the issue, because we could be talking about lots of different things that at a certain point in time really do have a moral judgment. I mean, all I could imagine is, a room full of German soldiers, officers, talking in the Second World War somewhere about what they're going to do about increasing production out of some of these concentration camps. Everybody's sitting there going, okay, well, it's an efficiency problem. And the moral judgment about the overarching problem that's involved in what they're what they're implying is not in the room. So yeah, of course you need to have discriminant judgment about these things. I understand that. I think it was Elie Wiesel who said something like, if you say to someone that X person has killed 1,000 people, then you can fathom that. You can feel the moral weight of that. But if you say that someone, say like Hitler, has been, responsible for the death of 6 million people, you can't wrap your head around that. So judgment in the abstract becomes so difficult, and that's probably why Joseph Goebbels was able to get away with so much propagandistic power in whipping up mass hysteria in the German people just before the war, in his sort of overarching anti-Semitic project of rewriting history and the future Germanic program according to, the needs to find an enemy, a completely artificial enemy that they needed to make up And this is the typical demagogic move. By finding the fake enemy, the scapegoat, you somehow are the new, as it were, hero of the picture. And to me, this is not that unusual. But what I do think is unusual, regardless of whether we're talking about mass genocide or anything at all, it just seems as if, in some way, the idea of suspended judgment is very difficult to see nowadays. Suspended judgment is, like, I think about this so often. I have this image that actually happened in my life, and it may seem trivial right now, but just think about this for a second. So in my context, I was one time in Copenhagen. Now, people who know me know I have a special love of Scandinavian thoughtfulness. Scandinavians are very reflective people. They're close to nature. They have this kind of like, I guess, this closeness to the openness of the world. They are very, I guess, reluctant to be judgmental. And it probably has to do with not only the Scandinavian aspect, but the fact that they've got this Protestantism kind of grafted right on top to make things even more impersonal, as it were. So for them, being open-minded about things and not coming to quick judgment is very important. It isn't a matter of ego or anything. It's just a matter of living up to your responsibility as a thoughtful individual, that you should somehow continue to formulate the thoughts. And the worst problem for them can be someone who rushes to judgment or rushes to action. In a world in which it seems we're increasingly inundated, swamped really, by impulsive behavior from top to bottom at all institutions and individuals, that seems to me like an increasingly attractive alternative. Don't you agree? So in any case, in Copenhagen, I remember being in this cafe, and I'm sitting at this table having an espresso like anybody else. And I take notice of the people around me, and I notice that there are these four gentlemen, young guys, and they're sitting at this table and they're having an espresso as well. And what happens is they're smoking, and each one of them, now it's four, so each one is sitting on a different side of that table, right? And they've got their cigarette in their hand, between their fingers, and they're just sort of looking off with a 1,000-yard stare out into the distance, quiet. And it occurs to me that not only are they speaking very softly, which is very common in Northern Europe, people don't shout, but the piece is that they're not actually really doing much talking at all. So imagine four guys just sitting there looking right past, at the same eye line as everybody else, but they're looking right past the guy in front of them, right? And as if they're thinking, and they've got the cigarette, and they're just kind of, just quietly, pondering. And I notice that the amount of time that has been accorded to the factor of silence is enormous. It's almost uncomfortable for me. Like, I'm just waiting for somebody to jump in and actually say something. And 5 seconds pass. 10 seconds, a while, a minute. Then one guy just nods his head and he says something. And the other guy's quietly. Nobody responds very quickly. The same idea, very quiet. And then they nod. Somebody else jumps in and might say something. Maybe not jump in, more like slide in eventually. And I realized that there's something about the social behavior that is being exhibited in this particular group that is almost intentionally designed to avoid trying to tell someone else that you're trying to take over. You're really trying to avoid making any rash or dominant moves. That in a way what you're exhibiting to the group itself, while the group itself is doing it mutually, is a commitment to thoughtfulness, a commitment to reflection, a commitment to just open contemplation. Even if I had been, super proficient in Danish, I wouldn't have been able to know what they were talking about, because the fact that even though they're just at one table over from me, maybe 5-6 feet, they were speaking so quietly that I couldn't hear what they were saying. And it was from that I stayed about as long as I could. And I had to go meet some folks, and I had to leave. I think I was there about 45 minutes. And the entire time, they were just there doing this. And I must say, it's not the only time I've actually seen that behavior. And I was I must say, marveled by it. The philosophical school of Gurdjieff has some notions for what it's like to understand oneself in circumstances where you can, as with any philosophical school, gain objectivity on your own behavior and your own presence. And one of the phrases, or one of the terms that I know that they use, is the word self-remembering. So self-remembering is this idea where you kind of take a photograph of yourself as though you were someone else in the room that you're in. No matter what else happens, you somehow have stepped outside, almost like an out-of-body experience, and remembered yourself in that moment. And you can do it intellectually, but there are these sort of existential moments where you really do have these out-of-body experiences, like where you literally just remember yourself, looking at yourself and going, all I could remember was that this happened. And sometimes it happens even in the most trivial circumstances. It doesn't have to happen because you're about to be run over by a train or something. It can happen sometimes randomly. The importance of these moments is that from them, you never have like this verdict, this judgment that you're right or that you're wrong, but actually you literally just have this external view of who you are at that moment, what you're doing at that moment, and that stays with you for a long time. And the first moment of something like this that had happened came to me in an external circumstance where I was probably, I think, 9 years old, and my grandfather, who was a very wise man, now I specifically understand this even more clearly than I ever did before, said one time, I said, what is the meaning of life? I remember I asked this, we were walking, and he said, the meaning of life is a mystery, but I'll tell you that one thing about this mystery: it has moments that are not forgotten. And I thought the wording was unusual, and he said, you'll remember this day. I'll tell you right now, you will remember this day, and you'll know what I mean. I never had anybody telling me you'll remember this day. And we were literally walking down the sidewalk. It was a completely banal moment. I never forgot it. And I wouldn't say that it haunts me, but I would say that it's remained with me. It stayed with me in such a way that I can't quite get that thing out of my head. It's like a part of my life now. It's part of my script. Why is it that someone can make a memorable moment in your life, but you can as well, see? And it seems to me as if the idea of coming to judgment, the idea of rendering that final verdict about whatever it is that you see, is a way of killing something. It's a way of killing it. It's like we have this incredibly, unbelievably intolerable for me person on television, Judge Judy, and I refuse to watch any of this, but you can't help it. You're in someone's house and you see this kind of thing. And I have some relatives that have seen some of this stuff, and so this person is the photo-negative, the antimatter at the existential level of everything I represent at all. Because while I don't necessarily believe that there are no such things as injustices in life, or that you of course obviously clearly have to take decisions into account, and sometimes wrong things happen and people have arguments, the fact that they've come to stand before someone who as a professional is going to render a judgment is already kind of a failure of sorts up to this moment, meaning that the agreement, maybe such as it was in its beginning, was not honored, let's say. People did things that they said they weren't going to do, or the inverse. They end up having some sort of an argument. They may have looked to different ways of resolving it, and in the end, all of these different roads lead to the sort of impasse that can only be decided by somebody who has no stake in the outcome but all the authority to decide it. And this individual just boils down to the facts, doesn't care about anything, doing the work that a judge does, right? And in the end, okay, I find fine for the verdict, etc. But she's so horrible in the way that she just can't avoid humiliating people in the way that she acts. She's not acting, in my view, in a judicious manner. A judicious manner does really, to me, exist in a manner that is sort of attitude free. In other words, okay, you didn't do this and you didn't do this. Okay, I understand. That's the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. The disagreement, something was changed. You didn't hold up your part of it. Here you go. That's it. And I find for the, I find for the defendant. I find for the plaintiff. Case over. This individual has to go on in some way as if to, in a way, almost deride or humiliate people, where she's just, she gets this sadistic pleasure out of just additionally insulting individuals involved in it. And I think not only is it unprofessional to do so, but in almost every case I've seen, I've probably seen many, maybe 30, 40 cases that she's done, in her verdict and in her little, self-serving performance there, she's always excessive in the end in what she's telling people. And the audience eats this thing up, because in a way, there's a way in which perhaps, I don't know if it's the matter of television or some such, or that we need to be entertained by someone whose grasp on certainty is much stronger than ours might be. Say, for example, we're looking for certainty in the world, and here's someone who can actually professionally render it. The cases themselves are not important. What we need to see is she's got to come in here like the samurai and behead something, It seems a little gladiatorial. But to me, what's pointless about all of this is that there's no way in which this kind of behavior, this kind of forum, can ever transcend the problems that it has been set up to consider. Because if you imagine, what happens is that everybody sees this sort of thing and they realize, okay, well, so that's how it works. Okay, we are not going to really sit here and arbiter something, mediate something. We're not going to counsel our way. We're not going to be friendly about anything. We're not going to have somebody who's going to do the hard work of the real dialogue and go through it. What we're going to do is we're going to show up, and in 5 minutes our case is going to be decided. And so somebody's going to be right or wrong. So rather than deal with all the hard work of trying to learn something and grow emotionally speaking out of any of this, what we're going to do is I'm going to see you in court. I'll see you in court, buddy. Or we're going to court. We're going to court. You want to go to court right now? We'll go to court. And a person who wins a case, let's say, or who's seen someone win a case, can't wait to have their ego completely exploded into the most, I imagine, self-serving way of sort of just like seeing, oh, this is what it's like to really humiliate someone. I'm going to have to find this person wrong. And that system feeds on its own kind of energy rather than creating circumstances in which people can sit down and go, I really do need to think about this kind of thing. I'll give you examples of worlds in which people can transcend judgment. How many times have you not seen or heard about someone who has some sort of incredibly physical, problematic, maybe crisis in their life, right? And either the family left them, or they were, arrested for something, ended up in jail, or the worst case, recently I just found out, somebody I know very well has a cancer. So at that point, what happens is that the things that you shoot for in life, that you work for, the things that you believe in a way will somehow converge on your own goals, which involve those 1,000 decisions a day about what it is that you're not going to take time out for, and the things that you do need to take time out for. All of that just washes away in the complete, just like, landslide of the drama about what could be an unexpected end to the project of your own survival. And at that point, a person who would have imagined the sort of Judge Judy's circumstances of a case, or anything that they might have thought was worthy of their time and attention, would probably think that was pretty darn trivial indeed. That in some way, a person such as that, even if someone came to them with their little problems, would say, can I give you a little perspective? You guys are fighting over who's going to skim the pool, or the $1,500 about your balcony when the guy built your deck out in the back of your house or something. What I think you might want to think about is whether that's even going to be in your mind in your last few days and hours and in your deathbed. Now, that seems like it may be morbid to people, but you're going to be in that deathbed one way or another, sooner or later. At some point, it's going to come to you. And you're not going to be thinking about that balcony and that problem with the contractor. You're not going to be thinking about that. You don't care about any of these things. Those things are not important anymore. When something loses importance because you're in your last 96 hours of life, right? It probably wasn't that important in your first 96 years of life either. So let's just, imagine that we could just entertain ourselves with things that we consider important, because they might be important to other people. Being there for them, giving them time, listening, or trying in some way to leave a lasting mark, whether it's through a family or, maybe something you really love and you want to nurture it, and in a way, the practice of that love, as you project it onto the thing that you care about, is also changing you. Because at the end of the day, if death is a transformation, life can reflect these transformations creatively as well. But when people refuse to embrace the transformation and instead work toward only rigidity, judgment, verdict, right, wrong, what happens there is that's not really going to prepare you, I don't care what you say, for anything that's going to transcend the scope of this problem. But if, again, faced with some existential issue, we realize that the problem itself isn't as big as we thought, then the judgment itself is even smaller than the problem, isn't it? It's not important. I think a lot about these kind of things because I wrote this in my book. I must say, the engagement aesthetic, I just felt like part of what critics do in the art world is very similar to this kind of thing, where the issue is that rendering a judgment about a work of art, aesthetically speaking, is a way of killing the artwork as well, in people's minds as well as one's own. I can look at the Mona Lisa, for example, and I'm like, wow, what an extraordinary portrait by Leonardo. This is just a great painting. And I say that to people, and that's it. There's my judgment. Or, conversely, I can render, or someone else can render, an opinion about, well, okay, so it's a slightly ambiguous facial gesture. I'm not sure I understand the entire intention in that expression. It is quizzical, it's somewhat paradoxical. Does that make it, however, a great masterpiece? After all, there's really not that much to look at. It's a great painting, but putting it into a context, there are many portraits coming from the 16th century in which we see similar, let's say, inscrutable expressions. So it's not that great. No, yeah. Let's just take for a second the fact that someone might say that and use, as I have just here, maybe marshalling a little bit of maybe historical data, so a little piece of historical information for your consideration. Once you go through that, you're no longer going to be as interested in the work itself. And once I say it's a great painting, you may or may not be as interested in the work itself too. So as a result, either way, the work loses some vitality, you see. But now someone turns around and says, I've got birds happening over here, but let's say someone says, hey man, there's something about this work that goes beyond the physical two-dimensional plane of what's being presented here. There's a number of expressions that could be being portrayed in the Mona Lisa, but perhaps it's not expression itself that's being expressed. Perhaps it is the problem that we can't converge or decide upon what specifically is being portrayed here by way of what her emotion is, what her sentiment, her sensibility, what's on her mind. The fact that it is ambiguous is the intent, let's say, of the painter. So Leonardo wants us to look at something whose points of attention take us in different places. And by diverting all these things, he's keeping us slightly off balance, preventing us, let us say, from coming to a judgment. And as a result, it is in this, oil painting that we might be able to find a slight wedge or space that might open out onto what it means to not have a judgment. And to not have a judgment means you can still fix your gaze on it. You can go in different degrees of perceptual depth into it, at the surface level, or at the psychological level, or at the phenomenological level, or at the existential level, or at the ontological level, or maybe even at the psychic level. So maybe there's a spiritual level. And the oscillation between these different potential levels of interpretation is itself perhaps what a master painter like Leonardo could try to capture and put you in that space. Now, at that point, if we imagine someone giving this kind of a description of a work, wouldn't you want to look at it again? Wouldn't you want to take a second look? Wouldn't you want to potentially see where this goes? So, in a way, we have made a trade. We have exchanged judgment for engagement. And there's lots of times when we do things like this. I mean, some of the most captivating film stars that we see on the screen are people who we can't judge, because we continue to engage physically with them because their faces are kind of, we're not too sure what they're saying. I think of someone nowadays like Tom Hanks, whose expressions on his face are so underplayed and who gives you a sense of constraint and restraint, and there's a lot going on inside, that he's really kind of a modern day of maybe a Bresson kind of film character, let's say. It's almost deadpan approach, And I think that in some ways, people like that, for us, become almost like statues we look at. They just happen to be moving, And we see that in exactly the same way as we might see a Bernini work. Beautiful white marble with expressions and gestures and movement and flow that keep you, let's say, moving toward it in different directions, looking around and around and around. So that's maybe one way that the artist plays with our attention, because there isn't one fixed idea. There's not like one bullseye that you were going to just only look at and that's all you see. You don't quite know what's coming next. I don't think that we need art. We don't need actors. We don't need any of this to get us to that place. The idea of sort of, a meditative life is that you can generate this about a lot of things. I mean, it's just to be in a kind of state of confusion, and from that confusion, some productive thoughts might themselves emerge. People don't like to be confused. People don't enjoy being in a space of open ambiguity. But that can be a form of engagement. And I think that can go somewhere. For me, it certainly does. I know that at any point in time I can get off the train of thought. Anytime, at any station. and render a judgment at any moment. Right, wrong, shallow, deep, well argued, or rather reactive. It doesn't matter. The beauty of having your own willpower in your own mind is that you can render that judgment at any point in time. But when I come up with decisions very quickly, I don't necessarily find that they help me in the long term. Just quick decisions for me, or quick verdicts, are not evidence of presence of the kind of material that I need to take me further and change. So eventually, decisions, when they're very similar one to another, become an inferential chain of similarity that creates a personal mythology you can end up finding very boring. Many people are bored with their own mythology. You have to really maybe perhaps think outside of some of that judgment to arrive at some openness. It's a little bit of risk, and you have to put time in it. You have to be willing to not be so sure. And it just doesn't seem to me like that's something people are willing to spend too much time on these days. It just doesn't, the search for certainty, it's a search for like stupidity at the same time. Some of the most stupid people you ever come across are the people who are very sure of everything. And some of the most interesting people you ever know are the people who are willing to think through things. And at the end of the day, they may tell you something that's nothing close to a final verdict on anything, but nonetheless is generous because it gives you some further thoughts about it. I recently just had a conversation with CC Moss here in LA, who's just really, she finished her PhD on internet art in the expanded internet art world, as it were, at NYU, and has worked as a curator in San Francisco, New York, here in LA. And this young woman is extraordinary. Her mind is so fast, and she just catches on to so many things that she's been just super aware of, that she's not blindsided by anything, but she's incredibly open. And she doesn't spend time judging things in a way where, you can just sort of either idolize them on the one hand or dismiss them on the other. She considers them data points that she allows to think about a little bit further and synthesize, and be open to these things. And as a result, then they incorporate and, they, inside of her, assimilate into a series of larger and larger and larger perspectives. I think that's just exactly for me. If that's not the textbook definition of a healthy, dynamic mind in this crazy world, I don't know what is. So I think that's a fantastic model, and of course, remaining open to things allows you to absorb more stuff more quickly, whereas being closed off and going, I don't like this kind of thing and I don't like that kind of thing, but I do like that sort of thing, basically doesn't allow you to absorb more things. It allows you to absorb fewer things, because essentially the only kinds of things we'll consider at any given point begin to become more and more autonomously similar to each other. And in a view, that's not a very integrated way of seeing the world. And Joseph Campbell said it, right? Integration is the challenge. So I do think that's kind of where we need to go. I'm not exactly sure that you can teach that to people. There isn't a doctrinal, ideological, pedagogical way to show people how to be more thoughtful, except to practice it with them. And I think we have a lot to thank the Greeks in their young curriculums, their curricula, they would basically teach their kids how to work through certain problems. So they have this notion of rhetoric and logic. They took these thinking ways very seriously in order to be able to use reasoning, not to stop reasoning, but to amplify and enhance reasoning to foster reasoning. And a lot of times that involved, working through the nuances of argument. So they teach their kids rhetoric and logic, or sometimes working through the nuances of how to avoid judgment in a way in which judgment eventually will come, and that's the problem of ethics, right? Or how to understand that you know for sure, how to question your own judgment of something as to whether you really know what you're looking at to be true, and that's the problem of epistemology, right? Or to just even question the nature of the being of things. Is something there, and why is it there as opposed to not there if it's really there? Which is a large question. That's the question of ontology. They dealt with all these things. We're no longer really interested in any of this. When was the last time you heard anyone going, well, okay, I'm like working through the problems of like ontology so that I can enhance my own perspective on things? I mean, anybody who does that, I'll buy him a dinner. You can come to my house, or we'll go have a coffee, and I want to know from you where you're going with this, and I will share with you. But it's the only place we can go that has any future. You know, verdicts come and go. They get overturned. Judgment is finality and the end of thought and reasoning. Open-mindedness, well, that's a road that has no end, and you don't know where it's going to take you. My friends, Francisco Ricardo, thank you for spending a little time with me on this meditation. I'd love your thoughts on this, and we'll speak soon.